you introduce yourself, what library we're at?
Okay, my name's Randy. I'm at the Floyd County Public Library in Prestonburg. We are trying to have more and more events where authors come, and Mr. Prather reached out to me from what the information he's given me and what we've used is to promote his event. He's done an extreme amount of research on his subject and on what he's written about, and we're happy to have him here, Mr. Prather. We're glad you came to Prestonburg. I'd love to hear what you got to say, and hope everybody will enjoy. Mr. Robert Prather. Thanks, sir. Come on in, sit down. Come on in.
Thank you, Randy. Come right on in, sir. As Randy has told you, my name's Robert Prather, author of The Strange Case of Jonathan Swift and the Real Long John Silver. Probably one of the longest titles you'll ever see in a book, and it does get kind of tiresome writing that whenever I tell people what the book title is. But that's the one my publisher chose, and I think they made a good choice on it. It kind of captures at least part of the meaning of what's in the book. I'd like to thank Randy Reno for allowing me to come out today and speak to the good folks of Prestonburg about a local legend here. Pretty much spreads all the way through the eastern portion of Kentucky, the Swift silver mine legend. And let me compliment you on your beautiful town. Prestonburg is certainly a beautiful spot, and you have a nice facility here as well in your library. Show of hands, has anybody here heard of the Swift silver mine legend? Got one here. Okay, I'm a little surprised that more of you haven't heard of this. This is an area that typically there's a pretty high percentage of people that have heard about Swift and his activities in this country. There's a lot of different aspects regarding the legend of Swift. Most of the information that we get about him comes from folk tradition. It's been handed down from people to people through the generations. And it basically began in the 1780s regarding Swift. The first mention of Swift actually occurred in 1788, the mention of Swift and a silver mine. And it was due to the gentleman that you see on the screen here, who was Kentucky's first historian and cartographer, mapmaker, John Filson. In 1788, John Filson and a gentleman by the name of Robert Breckenridge took out what was the first of a four-step process to have land granted from the state of Virginia to the individual. Filson and Breckenridge took out a land entry, is what that first step is called. And Filson also is a piece of the mystery that surrounds the Swift legend. There's a great deal of mystery that surrounds the legend. One is, where was his vast treasure that people are talking about? That was the bulk of the stories, was all about Swift and a group of men that came to eastern Kentucky primarily. You'll hear spots where they came other than eastern Kentucky, but he's primarily associated with areas from Alexandria, Virginia, through West Virginia today, and then eastern Kentucky. Just so happens John Filson, as I mentioned, in 1788 took a land entry, and it mentions on the entry that the land was to be laid out in a square to the cardinal points of the compass, And in the center of the property was to be a silver mine. And part of the old crucible was left there, the old smelting furnace. And he was made aware of this by a man named Swift. So this was 1788, and it's widely believed and pretty much known that this is the first connection between Swift and a silver mine somewhere in Kentucky. Part of the mystery, as I mentioned, is due to the fact that the same year that Filson took out the land entry was the very year of his disappearance. And it's often been said that his disappearance was directly related to the Swift silver mine and some of the shenanigans that was going on pertaining to that. The difference between my book and what has really been written about Swift up to this point is that I branch out from the existing tradition stories, the legends and all that that's held by locals from Alexandria to this area, there's actually pocket areas in 7 different states that are familiar with the Swift legend and that he is actually connected with it. And once I'll make sure that everybody here today gets a treasure map for coming out, and it's referred to as the Swift's treasure map. And it's not, of course, an authentic map, but it is in a way, which I'll explain that more later. It marks all the different spots that he actually owned land in Kentucky and Virginia. This is, what you see on the screen here, the original land entry between Robert Breckenridge and John Filson as tenants in common. Talks about that the very vague as far as where the property was. Mentions that it was 60 miles, 60 or 70 miles northeastwardly from Martin's Cabin, which today we know is in the westernmost part of Virginia. Also mentions here a certain man named Swift. Reports that he has extracted from the mine some silver. And of course, Filson and Breckenridge were very interested in this. During this time, it didn't take long where a frenzy, I guess you would call it, started. It was a bit like the gold rush of the West, the 49ers, where people started coming into Kentucky looking for Swift's treasure. Another gentleman that's associated with Swift and the silver mine is a gentleman by the name of Gilbert Imlay. Imlay was a historical and very interesting study in his own self, in his own right. This is his map of Kentucky. It's an early one. This is just an inset of the bigger map. And it shows here, you can see where it says reputed silver mines. Also, it shows here a great salt spring. This is all very important because it fits into the puzzle that once you find out some other things, it becomes very important. Now, I hate to say it, but it's the truth that most people, historians, geologists, have pretty much written off any possibility that Swift found any sort of silver or gold ore in Kentucky in commercial quantities. But they don't completely rule it out, which is interesting. And believe it or not, there is quite a bit of silver that's mined in Kentucky as a byproduct of zinc and lead, more than you typically hear about, which makes it interesting. This typically is coal mining country through here. All right, let me back up and tell you just exactly where all this was. We'll find out that present day, that this area here, you can see the Big Sandy River coming down through here. This would be the Tug Fork, and this would be the Levisa Fork. Keep in mind that we've got a great salt spring right here, which is interesting. And this area here is actually in the Paintsville area, which is just a little north of Prestonsburg. Okay, now what takes it from out of legend and out of hearsay into fact is kind of a multi-step process here. The first thing that I found, I had to look pretty hard to find this tie-in to Eastern Kentucky. And it seems like once I started finding some things pertaining to Eastern Kentucky regarding Swift, some of the dominoes started to fall. This is an indenture, and it was found in Lexington, Kentucky. The property that they're talking about here, the indenture was originally filed in the original Fayette County of Kentucky. During Swift's time period, of course Fayette today is the Lexington, is where Lexington is. During Swift's time period, Fayette was a much bigger county. It was a huge county. It actually went from beyond to the west of Lexington today, clear to the Great Sandy River, the Big Sandy. So it encompassed a big area. Now they actually mention here that that this property was on the Big Sandy River. So that gives us a general idea of where the property was. Talks about Jonathan Swift right here. He paid 5 shillings for this property, purchased it from a man his name was James, George James. This is just another section of the indenture. You can see he mentions George James and Jonathan Swift. Now, another step in the process of determining more about Swift. To begin with, you have a man that's associated with all these vast treasure stories. Swift and his men came, typically the stories go from Alexandria, Virginia, and they came either a northern route up to the mouth of the Big Sandy, or they came in through one of the gaps in southern Kentucky today. And but Big Sandy has always been associated with the legend. He and his men, typically a party of around 15, which is pretty interesting, I think, because in part 3 of my book, part 3 is actually a thesis proposing that Robert Louis Stevenson based his classic Treasure Island around the story elements of the Swift legend. And which sounds like a bold statement, but once you really get to digging into it, it almost seems ridiculous that it wasn't. There's just, and I won't be able to get into any details unless somebody really wants to know about it. I can answer some questions, but I'm going to focus on the land today and the basis of the legend. But to find that Swift and his men, there's some of them, one of the gentlemen's name was Mundy. Another of the primary people was Montgomery. Montgomery was the one that was said to have been the coin maker for the group, or some people refer to him as the counterfeiter of the group. And he actually hammered out some coinage during that time period. There has been found in the eastern part of Kentucky, there's no way of knowing how many different finds that there has been regarding silver coins or silver bars. It's amazing what all has been found in various areas of eastern Kentucky through 150 years or so. But what we want to do is bring all those old stories about Swift and his men coming into Kentucky and either mining here or just bringing their treasure into the state to store it, which brings you to another element of the legend, was the great treasure storehouse, where over a period of 10 years, Swift and his men came into Kentucky and concealed within what they refer to as a great cave, vast riches. That it's said that part of it originated in Kentucky and various places, and Swift is also even associated with the Spanish Main. It was said that he owned at least shares in several merchant ships, and real life basis backs up this part of the legend also. The Jonathan Swift actually did own a number of treasure ships or merchant ships, and there's a full page in the book of the ships that he owned or was in charge of. So we want to find all these real life things, such as a deed, and then the next element of process of figuring out just where the properties was that he owned. This is an original survey of the area that you just seen there, or the indenture that you just seen, and then the area that was on the Imlay map. As mentioned, in that area he actually owned 2 tracts of land, and between the 2 of them they totaled 10,000 acres, and they were purchased from George James. Now, this was part of the fun part for me when investigating this legend, was to recreate the original surveys. What you do, you take the survey that was just on the screen, and you can take the surveyor's description of the land, and he gives a full description. You'll notice here that this property happens to be laid out to the cardinal points of the compass. In other words, everything's north and south on it, or east and west. There's no varying degrees of anything. It's just pretty much a straight rectangle. You can take that, and what he gives here is pole measurements, like from A to B would be a certain amount of poles. 1 pole equals 16.5 feet. So what you do, you just take that and convert all your measurements and everything to where it'll fit on a present day topographical map. And what you want to try to do is get all these surveys that you can and make the grid of these original surveys that you're working on as big as you can. And then when you lay it on present day topographical map, it'll cover a bigger area, and all the different water courses that's mentioned on the survey hopefully will match your corresponding present day topographical map. What you see here's the property that was just on the screen, and it was 6,915 acres, and this one is 3,085 acres, totals 10,000 acres. These properties, all in here this property is Swift's and this one is Swift's. The rest of them, as a matter of fact, the entire rectangle here was owned by George James at one time, which was about 35,000 acres. Now, I think you'll agree with me by putting these surveys together that it matches present-day topographical map remarkably well. This, I believe, there seems to be no doubt about it, is that great salt lick that was mentioned on Gilbert Imlay's map. And they refer to this as the Salt Rock on this particular survey right here. You'll notice this is the Levisa Fork that comes up through here, and it's a perfect match on this map. Of course, Paintsville is an area that's strongly associated with the Swift legends. And then here we have Swift associated. Actually, wasn't just passing through like the legend said. He actually owned land in that area. It's a match in more ways than one. When I was putting this together up here, I thought, well, something didn't work right on this one right here. I put that one in there, and I thought, there's that water, or that fork there of these water courses, and it doesn't match anything on the southern one. But if you look, once you put it together, here's that same fork right here. So that's proof. All this is proof, and there's some other. This little branch here is also on here. It's hard to see on there, but it's actually there. And pretty much matches all the way around, so we know that that's a match. Now it's not on this map here, but just off to the west a little bit from here, there's a place called Silver Hill, or Silver Mountain, which has long been associated with Swift. And it just barely misses his property there. Now, this brings it into this area a little better, and this is the new portion. This is what really made part 3 of the book. The book that I'm selling here today is the 3rd edition, and this is the new part, or part of the new part. There is a new chapter devoted to this. It's a major discovery regarding the old 200-year-old legend, and it's due to the fact that Jonathan Swift was granted 100,000 acres. The property was described as being in Kanawha County, which present day is in West Virginia. Of course, during Swift's time period, it would have been Virginia, Kanawha County, Virginia. Well, as you can see, here's Prestonburg. Here's where we are today. And Pikeville, according to this survey reconstruction, actually sits upon land that Swift owned. Now, the reason why we know that this is the right location, Kanawha County, if you were looking at a map today, Charleston, which is where Kanawha County is today, would be up in this area here. Well, Kanawha County actually took up this entire area during Jonathan Swift's time period. So we know that that was part of Kanawha County when Swift filed for that, or was granted that land. And it talks about the property. The first step on the survey mentions that it begins across the mouth of Shelby Creek. And this is Shelby Creek that runs up through here, which happens to be very close to where an old gentleman made a major discovery back in the early to mid 60s regarding the Swift legend. As mentioned before, Swift had 2 methods of coming into Kentucky. One was coming down through Charleston, up like from Morgantown, Pennsylvania area, and then dropping down to the mouth of the Big Sandy and coming down in that way. And then the other was coming up through one of the gaps. And if you came up Shelby Gap, if you came in that way, all he had to do was follow the creek to its mouth, and his property was straight across from it. Now, an interesting part, I think, for Prestonburg and for everybody. As I mentioned, one of the primary associates pertaining to the Swift legend was a gentleman by the name of Montgomery. And you'll find that most of the names associated with the legend are close, but no cigar. John, or Swift himself, is referred to as John, Jonathan, sometimes William Swift. And sometimes when the legend really becomes perverted, he's even referred to as Smith. And but anyway, we know for a fact that his name was Jonathan Swift, and he was from Alexandria, Virginia. As mentioned, Swift was not the only one that's associated with this thing. Montgomery and Mundy, a gentleman by the name of Fletcher was a big player, and a gentleman by the name of Flint was one of the primary characters of the Swift legend, which is another interesting thing because Flint was a major character in Treasure Island. Montgomery, what we want to do is try to find any sort of legal documentation that supports any of the names of the party, the Swift party. And here we have to the south of Swift a gentleman by the name of Montgomery owned 100,000 acres. He was granted 100,000 acres also. This property, the southern portion of it, pretty much ran what appears to be the ridge line of Pine Mountain today. You'll also notice that Montgomery owned 142,000 acres, 142,236 acres that adjoined the Swift property on his north line. And that property encompasses where Prestonburg is today. And so you can see all these legends that have made the history books. There's a number of history books, and they used to teach the Swift legend in school. But you don't hear much about it today. If you do, it's sort of in a negative fashion, that they think it was made up. They made up the stories to sell land, or is one of the theories today. But that doesn't hold water with all the discoveries that I've made. You'll notice that all the way from Pine Mountain clear up to pretty close to where Paintsville is today, they own property all the way up through there. And it was said over a 10-year period that Swift and Montgomery and Mundy had some sort of operation going on over here. It's this area right here, or this line that comes down through here like this, is Johns Creek. I know that because all the lines hit on where the creek is today. Johns Creek, everybody knows, or a lot of people know, was named for John Swift. And now we know why, for sure. Why? And up until this point, nobody realized that he owned all this land. They thought he was just passing through. He was a pirate, him and his men. They were storing treasure. But he actually owned 100,000 acres of land here. And the headwaters of Johns Creek was on his land. And so that's why Johns Creek got its name. And that verifies the old belief that Johns Creek was named for John Swift. Now, it's also been said that the Tug Fork was named for Swift, which, knowing all of this, makes you believe that the Tug Fork probably was named for Swift. And it's said that he and his men fashioned these silver bars in a way that had a hole in the end, and they could tug the bars across the Tug River. And that's how it got the name of Tug Tug River. When you have the old stories that have been passed down through generations of people, and boy, I mean to tell you, they're adamant. They tell you, yeah, that's just the way it was. My granddaddy said that his daddy told him, and all that. Well, this substantiates their stories. This substantiates what was in the history books. Now, the history books didn't have any of this in there. They actually give the story as it was just folk tradition, that the history that there's a history of Kentucky. Collins' History of Kentucky is a 2-volume set. Charles Kerr's History of Kentucky is a 5-volume set. Each of those get into quite a bit of detail, especially the Charles Kerr's History of Kentucky. There's an entire chapter devoted to Swift. There, as I mentioned earlier, there's textbooks that I actually have a couple of textbooks that were printed back in the 1960s that teaches about Swift. It's just a small part, but he was included, as he should have been. But it has been swept under the rug, and I have a theory about that, of course, and I get into it in the book. Trying to think if there's anything else I need to bring out in this area. Okay, Bill Gibson. Back in the early 1960s, a gentleman by the name of Bill Gibson, who lived in Jenkins of Letcher County, Kentucky, crawled back into a cave in this area right here and went about 9 miles in the bowels of this cave, all by himself. And he gives a vivid description of this enormous cave that he went back in. But the neat part about it was he crawled back in there, and his trip was made worthwhile when he found 7 kegs of Spanish pieces of 8. Each keg is described as being slightly smaller than a 5-gallon bucket. So that's pretty amazing. 5 bucketfuls of these things that he found. And he drug them out. The people of Letcher County, just about everybody there has heard of Bill Gibson. For good reason. In a few years after he made the discovery, they talked about it in a local newspaper there. And to boot, Bill Gibson probably gave away 600 or 700 of these coins that he found to people. And I've talked to a number of people that has a coin. Yeah, I've got one of Gibson's coins. And there's just a vast number of people in Letcher County that knows about his discovery. And the neat part about it is there's a page in the book that shows a lot of different varieties of these coins that I got to see from Gibson. And some of them look like they just came out of the mint in Mexico, and other ones look like that the die was just about worn out. If the stories were true and Montgomery was the coin maker, his die was just about worn out when he was making these last ones, because they're light and the impressions on them, you can tell in the book that they look counterfeited. They don't look worn out, they look like they've been counterfeited. And so that backs up the story of Montgomery being the coin maker. The coins were actually found on his property. That brings it all together. We have Johns Creek, Tug Fork, the Paintsville area, all this thing, and then a big treasure discovery here right on one of the associates' property. That's about all I'm going to get into with you today. I just wanted to show you that this old legend that has been around out there for over 200 years, since about the mid-1780s, is true. It's not bogus. And by all indications, it was far more than all of the stories could have ever imagined. The people that gave their account of this legend only seen what they, or only talked about what they seen, which is a tunnel vision of what was going on. Most of the time it was just about Swift coming in to this area and doing something here. They didn't know for sure, but he had treasure, and he was described as coming into Kentucky 100 pack horses strong. So this brings it to life. Brings the Swift stories back into the history books where it should be. It probably won't make it for reasons that you may read about, because it is controversial as to what he was doing. Rather than a pirate, I think he was a patriot, and he and his men were actually safeguarding what was our first treasury of this nation. Now, the reason I can say that is because Jonathan Swift's father-in-law was Brigadier General Daniel Roberto, who served under George Washington. Roberto happened to also serve on the Board of Treasury. Daniel Roberto's brother-in-law was the comptroller for the Treasury. Jonathan Swift's brother-in-law, who was Daniel Roberto's son, worked for the Register of the Treasury. The Register of the Treasury, his kinfolk owned one of the adjoining acres or properties that adjoined Swift's 10,000 acres in this area. It's kind of a small world, but to have that many connections to the Treasury cannot be a coincidence. And then, of course, just the fact that Swift is associated with so many different tales of treasure, that is substantiation in itself. And it didn't take place overnight, it took place over 10 years. And that's why all these different spots were associated with him. Uh-oh, went to sleep on me. This is just another property that Swift happened to own. This was a 20,000 acre tract. And here's another one that he owned in this area here. It's a 5,000 acre tract. These are the adjoining properties. That is an original survey of the 5,000 acre tract, which happened to sit, which was basically in the backyard of the gold vault. I think I'll end right there. Anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to field some questions for you.
You were saying that you think that the novels that were written were based on him and that supposed treasure.
You're talking about the
Island.
Robert Louis Stevenson's
Yeah.
Treasure Island.
And
I do. I believe it was.
what thread do you have that you?
What thread?
Yeah, that you're relating that to.
It once you start piecing together the real life, Robert Louis Stevenson. Let me just start from ground zero. Robert Louis Stevenson met a lady by the name of Fanny Vandegrift Osborne in Grez, France. Stevenson was there for his health, and she was there because she was having marital problems. They fell in love there. And long story short, he actually came to America and traveled across the United States and went to California, where her and her husband, Sam Osborne, was living at the time. And when he first went out there, story has it that she was still married. And she didn't obtain her divorce until after he came to California. And then they married in California, Stevenson and this Osborne lady. Spent their honeymoon in a desolate mining camp, which he based his book, Silverado Squatters, on. And within just a little while after Stevenson married, he wrote the Silverado Squatters, and just the same time period, he wrote Treasure Island. We back up a little bit. You'll see there that the Osborns, now Sam Osborn was from Louisville, Kentucky, which brings Kentucky into the picture regarding Stevenson. Fanny Vandegrift was from Indiana. Sam Osborn, there's actually a book written, it's called The Osborns and the Alleys of the Clinch Valley area. And it talks about how the Osborns came through this area. And there's actually a little town or a community. You may know where that is, Osborn. And it's just directly across from where the Swift property was. Now, so we have the Osborns. Robert Alley happened to be a gentleman that owned a Swift silver mine journal. So he in himself was famous regarding this Swift legend because he purported to have a Swift journal. Well, there's this book with the Alleys and the Osborns, and in this book they actually talk about Robert Louis Stevenson and how he married this former Osborn lady. So it really, the world gets pretty small all of a sudden. And then you have all these ties to the Swift legend. And Osborn, Sam Osborn that is, was interested in things pertaining to treasure and mining, because when he and Fanny left Kentucky, on their way to California, they stopped in Nevada and purchased a silver mine. So you have the Osborns that tie into this area strongly. If you really get into your deed books and genealogy books, you will find a host of different spellings of the name Osborn up and down through here, but it all comes from the same people. So that's about as far as I'm going to try to take that today. Also, if Treasure Island itself, also if you're familiar with the Swift legend and you're familiar with the mining associates and some of the elements of the stories, and you read Treasure Island, you'll think, wow. As a matter of fact, a lot of people think that the stories of the Swift legend came out of Treasure Island. But it was vice versa. Yeah. It's very cool. It's very cool. Yeah. Of course, Swift and his men were all thought to be pirates. They would have, the bystanders, the onlookers, wouldn't have had any other way to know what he was. They just called him a pirate. They knew they were bringing treasure in, and they probably knew not to mess with them. There was people that were disappearing during that time period. John Filson was one of them. Another very famous one that the last thing that ever was known about him is in 1793. He went off in search of Swift's silver mine. It was never seen again. And that was James Harrod. He built the first station in Kentucky. Harrod is now called Harrodsburg. And that was the last thing that was ever known of James Harrod. He went off in search of Swift's treasure. And there are other instances similar to that pertaining to it. So it would have been a bit of a scary thing to see Swift's pack train coming into Kentucky and all these stories that were beginning to circulate. You probably would have given them a wide berth.
So it sounds to me like that he wasn't actually mining silver, that he might have been actually bringing silver in.
That's my belief. Yes, that's my belief. I'll show you on this map that I created as a study guide for the book. You'll notice all the different pickaxes, cross pickaxes. Treasure has always been represented as an X on treasure maps. And even today, anywhere you have mining on topographical maps, they'll have a cross pickaxes or some sort of an X showing where it is. So all of these pickaxes that you see here are individual properties. This one happens to be next to the bullion depository. Here's the one that is in the Pike County, Pikesville area. Here's Montgomery's property. Here's the Paintsville property. But now if you'll look up here, here's the proposed routes that's associated with the legend, and just happens to be very likely that that's exactly the way he came in. This dotted line here shows how he would have come up to his property, either from a northern or a southern route. You go up this route here and you'll come to another property that he owned just outside of present-day Morgantown, which was a 901 acre property. And we know for a fact that they were mining iron in that area, and they could have been mining some other things as well. I did find where he's associated with areas that is in mining areas other than silver and gold. But it just so happens that this area here is in the Virginia Gold Belt, and he owned a number of properties in this area. This one right here had a silver mine on it. And that silver mine dated clear back to at least 1739. There was a survey made for old Lord Fairfax, and it showed that mine tract on there. And then through other documentation, we know that it was a silver and a copper mine. And it was operated to the satisfaction of the owners. And Swift happened to end up getting a piece of it. So that is probably Swift's legendary silver mine right there. But now, as mentioned before, he's also associated with he and his men and his ships plying their trade on the Spanish Main and bringing back treasure from that area. So let's bring another guy into the picture, George Washington. If you're Washington and trying to establish a treasury, you're not going to care where it comes from as long as you can establish that treasury. I mean, in order to make this country fly, we were going to have something to talk to other nations about. So Swift, in all likelihood, was doing George Washington's bidding through Daniel Roberto, who happened to be one of Washington's generals. During the Revolutionary War, Roberto actually set up a mining operation for mining lead for bullets. Of course, 75% of today's silver production comes as a byproduct of mining lead and zinc. So picture starting to clear up regarding Swift. There's a picture in the book there. George Washington actually presented, and you talk to people about it that knows much about Washington, and you realize that he didn't give a lot of things away. If he had all the people that he knew and all the people that came to see him, he wouldn't have ended up with anything. But he happened to give Jonathan Swift a portrait of himself, and it was painted when he was at Princeton during the Battle of Princeton. And Charles Wilson Peale was the artist on it, who was extremely historical artist of his time period. And it is recorded in Washington's diary where Swift and Dr. Craik would come to spend the night at Mount Vernon. Dr. Craik actually purchased land through Swift in this area here. And Dr. Craik, who was George Washington's physician and closest friend, also shared a business, or their buildings abutted in Alexandria. So Craik and Swift had a close relationship. It goes on and on. Swift's father was Samuel Swift. He was a law partner with John Adams. And he was also one of the Mohawk Indians during the Boston Tea Party. John Adams said that there should have been a holiday, a national holiday named in honor of Samuel Swift.
Sounds to me like that Swift was not a pirate, but he was an aristocracy.
He was, yeah, as much as you could have been during that time period. He was kind of right up there with George Washington, of course, with not on his level as far as the gentry of aristocracy is concerned, but he was way up there. He owned the largest mansion in Alexandria. And is there any other questions?
Do you know if Swift was a Mason or not? That would really tie it together.
Oh, he was a Mason, yeah. Yeah, he belonged to, as a matter of fact, when this book, when the first edition was released, the Alexandria, Washington Masonic Lodge number 22 held the debut of the book at the George Washington National Memorial there, Masonic Memorial in Alexandria. And if any of y'all that have ever been there, it's a tremendous building. It's a wonderful site. And the Masons hosted that for their brother Swift. Any other questions? Okay. Be glad to sell anyone a book that would like one. And also, everyone that's here, stick around. And just for coming out, I want to give you a treasure map today. And it's actually designed to be a study guide. For when you've read the book, you'll look at this map and you'll think, wow, it's amazing that Swift was associated with all these areas. And all the different legends that grew up around part of these areas, and now you know why. Thank you very much.